R.A. Lightstone, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. Nice to see you again.
Likewise. Now, Israel has killed a senior military leader of the Islamic Jihad group, which the U.S. designates as a terrorist organization. What do we know about this target?
Well, Islamic Jihad wreaks havoc even amongst Gaza, which is filled with people who wreak havoc. And when you talk about extremists, they are amongst the most extreme there. And it is their goal always to be able to be the last people to fire a shot at the beginning of a ceasefire and the first people to fire the first shot to create a disaster. So they practice terror. Every time they fire a rocket, it's a double war crime. They fire from a civilian area, deliberately at civilian areas. These are really, really bad guys. How could the death of Taysir al-Jabari impact the Islamic Jihad group? Yeah, meaningfully. Again, these groups don't have fantastic organizational charts. They have very top-heavy leadership. They take direction directly from their leaders. So every time you can get rid of a mastermind of one of these leadership groups, you have an opportunity to weaken them immediately over the long term. Over the short term, there's a sense of revenge. There's a sense of trying to cause chaos to avenge the loss of their leader. And you'll have a lot of people trying to find their way into this leadership piece. But the death of this guy running Islamic Jihad out of Gaza is a win for people who like freedom and a win for civilians everywhere. A number of deaths have been reported around this incident. There's so much bloodshed in this region. Is there another way, or is it inevitable considering the circumstances? Considering the circumstances, it's inevitable. But if you watch the precision strike that was taken, the chaos sensitivity that Israel has to try to root out only the terrorists is second to any other military in the world. Now, what winds up happening in Gaza is that the people of Gaza are true victims to Hamas, but everybody knew who they were living next door to with this person. It's not a secret. Everybody in Gaza knows who the Hamas members are, who the Islamic Jihad members are, who the members of other terror organizations are, and they choose to be there. Now, if there was an option to live somewhere else, some of them would possibly do that, but most of them do not. And there's a risk that's associated with that, and the ultimate risk is placed by the leader of Islamic Jihad, who chooses to live in a civilian area. He is a legitimate military target, and by placing himself by civilians, that's a war crime. He is trying to create the news of Israelis attacking civilians when by far that is not their intention. So would you say that there are terrorists hiding among civilians in order to avoid strikes from Israel? Oh, absolutely. That is their greatest security, is to surround themselves with their mothers and their wives and their children, thinking that is the ultimate safety net for them. The cowardice that these terrorists purport to have, sending other people to die on behalf of their mission, and at that time, protecting themselves with innocent civilians, it is really the height of hypocrisy. Rising tensions in the region, Islamic Jihad has vowed to retaliate. What do you expect to happen next and into the future? Well, what's happening as we speak is rockets are being fired from Gaza into Israel. Israel has this unbelievable innovation called Iron Dome that has the ability to shoot these rockets out of the sky. And you have 19 and 20-year-old young men and young women who have to make a split-second decision whether or not to blow up that rocket or to let that rocket fall, hopefully harmless, into a field. I've sat there with their missile batteries and watched these young men and women make these decisions in real time. It's an enormous amount of responsibility for an 18, 19, 20-year-old to decide how to protect their civilians that are sitting behind them. But there's an untold crisis that happens in Israel. And I was there when my wife and I had the privilege to work for the United States of America. We lived through 3 crises of rockets being shot from Gaza. If you've woken up in the middle of the night and tried to bring your kids down to a shelter and had to sleep there, or tell your kids they can't go to school today because of the danger of rocket fire, while nobody was injured during those attacks in my family and my neighborhood, the trauma is felt by my kids. To wake up in the middle of the night and to bring the kids down, it's truly traumatic. And what the goal of terrorism is to terrorize. And they are successful in terrorizing. It's a disaster. And how do you see this playing out long term? It seems to be, as Israel calls it, mowing the grass, try to keep the terrorism down to a minimum. I don't know any other country that will tolerate what would be considered a minimal amount of terrorism. There's even, according to the Europeans, there's an acceptable amount of rocket fire that can be fired from Gaza into Israel before Israel has a right to defend itself. One of the things that I know that we worked on in the previous administration was banishing the lexicon of Israel has a right to defend itself. You see many American politicians getting up and tweeting, Israel has a right to defend itself. That's an insane proposition. If you say they have a right, somebody else has the ability to say they don't have a right. Israel has a moral obligation to defend itself and its citizens, and every moment that they're not doing that, they are derelict in their obligation. It's not a negotiable right. Every citizen that goes to sleep at night in any country that they are part of should assume that their country is going to do everything possible to attack them. Israel, as the one Jewish state, seems to be held to a different standard time and time again, just as you and I spoke earlier this week about the eradication of the head of al-Qaeda for his perpetuating terror. So, too, we should be very happy that there's another person who wakes up every morning trying to kill civilians is now eliminated. And we should stand with Israel, not because Israel has a right to defend itself, but because Israel has an obligation to defend itself.
Aryeh Lightstone, former special envoy for the Abraham Accords and author of Let My People Know. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephanie.